All right. So, you've just, if you're following along on the days that I'm posting things, you just took exam 2 a couple of days ago. Now we're going to move on to talk about one other part of our first subject before we get to spring break. We're going to start talking about group processes. But I want to first bring your attention back to some of the concepts we talked about in conformity and obedience. These ideas of other people influencing us, us noticing the norms in a group, or the way that important people around us are acting and maybe fitting in with them, or acknowledging and even following people's requests or demands under different circumstances. So all these distinctions from conformity and obedience, I hope that, as I was going through those in the prior lectures, and certainly once we start talking about group processes here, you kind of notice that we have already been talking about group processes in a sense, because it can be really difficult to separate individual and group level processes in human beings just because we are so social in general. So last time, or the last few lectures, I tried my best to talk about these things in individual level terms or in isolation, but a lot of times that's just really not possible because remember, as I've mentioned a time or two, human beings just are inherently social animals. We have been successful as a species because we can cooperate and we rely on social groups and we have strong identities that drive our perceptions and behavior. So all those things that we talked about with conformity in particular, and other things having to do with other types of social influence and normative behaviors, compliance, all these things, they really have a lot to do with the groups that we identify with frequently. And we talked about this in terms of pro-social behavior as well. We're more likely to help people in the groups to which we belong because we can empathize with them because we see ourselves as similar, and we're less likely to help other people and other groups unless we have kind of an exchange worked out. And this even goes back to some of those ideas of kin selection versus, more transactional cooperative relationships. So lots of the things that we're going to talk about in terms of group identity, and even when we get into the prejudice sections, really influence the way we understand any given situation. So I hope as we go through these last few units, you're noticing how group processes kind of help us understand a lot of the things we've talked about already, and how a lot of those other things we've talked about in previous sections of the class in turn kind of inform us about the group level work too. So shifting to these last couple sections of the class, we'll spend a little bit of time at the very end talking about some applied social psychology, how we can use psychological tendencies and findings to address social problems and perhaps even improve things in the world. But the majority of the rest of the class is going to be focused on group processes within groups, between groups, and how those things lead to things like prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination. Before I turn to talking about some more specific group processes type topics, I think it's worth kind of making a bridge again back to the conformity and obedience section that we just finished up a bit ago. That list of terms doesn't necessarily show us the entire world of social influence, right? There's another one that we just didn't really talk about because usually people focus on it in group settings and group types of research. And to be totally honest, the more leadership research really happens in sociological social psychology than in straight up social psychology. But there is still, particularly in European research traditions, there is a good deal of study about leadership. So one example of this gets to the idea that our older conceptualizations of leadership sometimes focus on ideas about how leaders are just unique people who have captivating personalities and are able to, charismatically bring people into the fold to get them to do what they want. this kind of fits in too with ideas about great man of history type theories that are saying that individual people can really bring along giant swings in the course of history and things like that. But really, leadership is more successful when it has some slightly different attributes, when it's not all hinging on one person's influence or intellect or magnetic qualities. And really effective leaders as well are not ones that are really dominating their followers. They're people that are showing them that they're on the same team and they're able to buy into the same sorts of values and goals. Really effective leaders don't just order people around. They're not relying on obedience. They're not solely relying on their authority and position in a hierarchy. They are trying to motivate people and understand that they're working toward the same types of goals. So more successful leaders tend to try to influence what people want rather than trying to strong arm them into doing what they want. So, I mean, in some senses, I can see how maybe you might see this as a tad bit manipulative, honestly. The group members are trying to guide people's preferences, I guess, rather than physically or intimidating them into a pattern of behavior. But it doesn't have to be a manipulative thing. It can be that some leaders are recognizing the needs of their group and they're responding to them and trying to lead their group in a successful direction. But to do this, to get people to want what the leader wants, the leader can't just be some separate person up on a pedestal that doesn't relate to the people in their group at all. They need to show the group that they are a member, that they are similar to them in some way. So they need to demonstrate traits frequently that are prototypical or exemplary of the group as a whole. So they can't alienate themselves. They need to kind of immerse themselves in the things that make people members of those groups. One example of this that you see, pretty consistently in politics is when a leader tries to put forth an air that they're a person of the people. And oftentimes politicians and religious leaders are honestly, not very much like the vast majority of people. They come from relatively wealthy or privileged backgrounds, and they maybe don't engage in a lot of the activities that we tend to think of as defining normal people or real Americans, like, eating in a diner, driving a truck, drinking a beer in a dingy bar or something. But frequently on the campaign trail, you'll see lots of opportunities for politicians to position themselves as, very down to earth or a real normal person that you'd want to have a beer with, which is always a very bizarre and frustrating thing that we get told matters. But this is a pretty ubiquitous thing for politicians to do. And you see this as well when you have other people in positions of authority that they don't necessarily just want to use their authority to bludgeon people into submission and get them to do what they want. They want to show that they can relate. And sometimes these appeals are successful when it's believable, but when you can kind of see through it and tell that people are, just being kind of disingenuous or manipulative, it tends to be less desirable or successful. Good leaders, though, they are not generally just trying to pull one over on people. They are ones that are really passionate about what their group members or followers actually want and feel and think. They understand and they share those values, and they don't believe that they have all of the answers all the time, because truthfully, no one does. So people recognize that to some degree, and they want to understand that their leaders are people that have at least a little bit of humility, and they want input from other people to reach the best sorts of conclusions. maybe something we don't think about as much. I mean, I've been talking about this for the last slide and a half, but something we might not recognize all the time is that we really want the group to be cohesive in terms of how we see each other. That includes the members, the leader. We want to feel tied together in some way and value the identity of our group. And we're going to circle back to these sorts of ideas when we wrap up group processes. We'll talk about a perspective called social identity theory that talks about how we derive a lot of our self-worth from the group boundaries that we draw and the identities that we cling to or identify with. It's kind of hard sometimes to think about synonyms of identity or identify, so sorry about that in advance. But identities tend to be very, very important to keeping a group cohesive, and group leaders identify or recognize that, and frequently are, trying to show that they're part of that identity. The type of identity that a group has and the way a leader is going to express it is sometimes going to matter in terms of the types of goals a group has and the way a leader is trying to go about them. Your book has a distinction that I think is really important between a transactional leader and a transformational leader. And these are maybe terms you've encountered in other classes, maybe in lower level psych or sociology or business classes. Transactional leadership involves setting clear short-term goals that have very clear, well-defined rewards and punishments. So knowing that you're, going to get that raise if you finish a project on time or something like that. This can be very effective. It frequently might not get people to buy in as much because there isn't as much of a social identity component. It's more, as the name implies, a transaction. You do this for me, you'll get this reward, and if you fail or don't follow through, you might get a punishment. And we know that, conditioning and expectations about punishments and rewards can be very effective under some circumstances. But if you want to engender a sense of inspiration into a group or have them cohere together for a longer period of time, then it might be more worthwhile to try to follow a transformational leadership type of model, that you are really trying to shape the goals and values and identity of a group toward some longer term sorts of destinations, and get people to really come to identify with that group and feel that it's important for them and that everyone is on the same page and on the same team, rather than emphasizing that, if we fail at something, we're going to get punished. So an important distinction to think about. So I'll wrap up talking about leadership just by mentioning, too, that there was another article that I assigned. I don't want to give away the answer right here, but if you take a look at that article, you should be able to answer this question pretty straightforwardly. It has to do, again, with social identity and how a leader might identify with a group and what implications that has. So you can, if you feel like you want to answer that question now, you can go ahead and pause and find it on Canvas. Or if you want to just finish up this video or lesson and go back and do it later, that's fine too. But just remember that that is there. Okay. Some other, actually I'm going to stop this video now just so I can break them up a little bit more, and I will come back and talk about different types of group influences.